Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to really get into those complex philosophical arguments, those deep historical disagreements, so you can get properly informed fast. Today, we're not just, scratching the surface of an old philosophical fight. We are diving deep into something really fundamental from the Hellenistic world. It's this clash between the Stoics and the Epicureans about how we actually perceive reality. Now, for ages, this whole thing's been framed mainly as a disagreement about truth. You hear it all the time, right? Epicureans. All sense impressions are true. Full stop. They wanted this totally reliable foundation in the senses. Then the Stoics, maybe a bit more cautious, saying, well, hold on, sometimes they're false. So they needed to find this special kind of impression, the cataleptic one, that was guaranteed true.
Yeah, and that framing, it's accurate as far as it goes regarding their final stance on truth values. But it kind of misses the deeper structural disagreement that's really driving everything. To really get our heads around this, we need to shift the question, not just is it true or false, but fundamentally, what kind of thing is a sense impression?
Right. Is it inherently rational? Does it involve thinking from the get-go, or is it just raw input?
Exactly. That's the absolute core of it, the rationality of the sense impression. Are we talking about a rational state, something logique, or is it a non-rational state, allogon? Because whether you think perception itself involves reason, well, that changes everything about what you think knowledge even is and how we get it.
So that choice, rational or non-rational, dictates where it happens in the soul, what it's made of, structurally speaking, and crucially, what we need to do to get from just sensing something to actually knowing it.
So our mission today is to unpack why each side felt logically forced into their position. Here are the Epicureans trying to shield their criteria from any possibility of error, and the Stoics needing their criteria to be specific enough to actually justify beliefs. We'll see, it creates this philosophical standoff that honestly echoes right down into modern debates about knowledge.
Okay, so where do we start? The beginning seems logical. Where in the mind or the soul does perception even happen according to these two schools?
Right. So in ancient philosophy, how they thought the mind was structured, the sort of mental anatomy often really tied into their arguments. And the Stoics and Epicureans had completely different maps, you could say, for where perception happens and what role reason plays right at that initial stage. Let's start with the Stoics. They're the ones saying perception is rational from the start. Okay, so for the Stoics, getting a sense impression isn't just passive receiving. It's an active creation. And they locate this creation process squarely in the mind, or more specifically, to hegemonicon, which isn't just the brain in a modern sense, but the ruling part, the command center of the soul. And the crucial bit, this hegemonicon is where reason lives. So for them, reason has to be active, even if it's automatic, like below the level of consciousness, for an impression to even form properly.
So the eyes, the ears, they're just like windows or messengers?
Exactly, they're conduits. Or, as they put it, borrowing from Plato actually, they're the means through which the mind sees. The sense organs pass on the physical change caused by the object outside, but it's the rational mind, the hegemonicon, that takes that raw feed and processes it into a structured impression.
They pointed to Plato's Theaetetus for this.
Yeah, there's a passage there where Socrates argues pretty convincingly, that we perceive with the mind through the senses. So if the faculty doing the forming is rational, the thing that forms the impression must itself be rational. That's the Stoic logic.
Okay, so it feels like the instant that sensory buzz hits the command center, it's already organized. It's not just raw static anymore.
That's really the core Stoic idea here. There's no such thing as a truly unstructured encounter with the world once the mind gets involved. The mind's nature is to structure things rationally, and it does it immediately.
Okay, let's flip that. The Epicureans, they insist the impression has to be non-rational. So where do they put the event and why?
They completely reject that Platonic Stoic location. For the Epicureans, sense impressions get created entirely in the sense organs themselves, the eyes, the ears, the skin. They see it as just the bare, immediate physical reception of input. This input, for them, comes from these tiny films of atoms, the idola, constantly streaming off objects and physically hitting the sense organ.
And the absolute key for their structure is the mind, the rational bit, has zero involvement at this stage.
Absolutely none. It's formed without any activity from the rational part of the soul. And they had a pretty pointed argument against the Stoic window idea. You see it really clearly in Lucretius, the Roman Epicurean poet. Lucretius basically throws down the gauntlet. He says, okay, if the eyes are just passive doorways for the mind to look through, well, why do the eyes get dazzled by bright light? Why does the physical organ itself feel pain if sand gets in it?
A door doesn't get dazzled or feel pain.
Exactly. The fact that the physical non-rational organ has these reactions dazzling, pain prove for them that the sensory event, the impression itself, is happening right there in the non-rational organ. It keeps the rational mind out of it, pristine, ready for the next step, which is opinion forming. It protects the input.
Okay, so the location seems to drive the structure. The Stoics put it in the rational mind. So what does that formation process actually look like for them? How does it get its rationality?
Well, the Stoic mechanism is all about synthesis and predication. This is where their view gets really sophisticated, I think. When that physical alteration signal from the senses arrives at the hegemonicon, the rational mind instantly, automatically pulls from its library of concepts. Preconceptions, they call them. Basic ideas like white, table, human.
So it's not just passively receiving a picture, it's immediately slapping labels on things, an act of categorization.
It's an immediate cognitive act, yeah. The mind performs this tiny, incredibly fast judgment. It subsumes the raw sensory input under these existing concepts. So it takes the visual input, a certain pattern of color and shape, and instantly applies the concept table and the concept white. And that's what makes the resulting impression rational.
And the output isn't just a mental image then. It's actually structured like a statement.
Exactly. This immediate synthesis gives the impression itself a synthetic and predicational structure. It means the impression connects us directly to propositions, things we can state, dialecta in Greek. So it's not just experiencing whiteness near tableness. The impression is, in its very structure, the table is white.
That sounds incredibly fast, almost like an unconscious logical step. The sources mention it might be metabatic. What's that about? Is that term important?
Yeah, metabatic. It suggests a transition, or maybe even a kind of inferential step. It implies the process moves beyond just raw sensation into applying concepts into predication. The Stoics needed a term like that, I think, because they knew it wasn't just passive reception. The mind is actively moving from a physical change to something with propositional content. So the impression is metabatic because it contains this immediate automatic conceptual leap, linking the raw data to the structures of logic and language. And they felt this had to happen because the things we actually know and learn about the world are propositions.
Okay, that's a really complex active process. Now, contrast that with the Epicureans. If the mind does nothing, what's their mechanism? What's the structure of their impression?
For the Epicureans, it's all about pristine simplicity. Since the impression is purely the result of the physical interaction between the non-rational sense organ and those external idola, the impression has to be non-rational and structurally simple. Think of it like a raw photograph before any caption is added.
Right.
Or maybe even better, like the chemical change happening on the retina itself.
A reaction that can't hold memory or complex ideas.
Correct. The texts say it's incapable of receiving memory, and that the mind cannot add or subtract anything. The mind is strictly forbidden from tinkering with this initial input. Because if the mind did contribute concepts, if it jumped in and said, "Oh, that's a table," it would be adding interpretation. And for the Epicureans, interpretation is precisely where error begins.
So the Epicurean impression is simple. It's true in the sense that it happened, but it doesn't actually say anything definitive about what it is. It's kind of ambiguous.
You could say that. It's true that this pattern of idola hit the eye, but it doesn't carry the interpretation, "This is a table." That interpretation, the adding and subtracting of concepts, the synthesis, the predication, all of that is pushed back.
Pushed back to when?
To the next stage, the formation of opinion, or doxa. That's a separate, later mental event where the rational mind finally looks at the simple sensory data it received and then applies concepts. For the Epicureans, if you want your foundational input to be absolutely, undeniably error-free, it must be pure sensation, untouched by the faculty that makes judgments and, well, messes things up sometimes.
Okay, so this whole deep disagreement about structure rational versus non-rational, it's not just philosophical nitpicking. It's driven by something they both fundamentally agreed on, right? Both schools were foundationalists. They both believed that sense impressions, or at least some of them, had to function as criteria of truth, the bedrock, the ultimate court of appeal for knowledge.
Absolutely critical point. They're both grappling with skepticism. How can we be sure about anything? And they both point to the senses as the ultimate source of evidence about the world. But, and this is the crucial divergence, what they demand from that sensory evidence, and therefore what their ultimate goal for knowledge looks like, is completely different because of the structural choice they made.
The Stoics had a very specific goal state in mind, catalepsis.
Yes, cognitive apprehension, catalepsis. That's the gold standard for Stoic belief. It's a belief you form by assenting to, by saying yes to, a very special kind of impression, a cataleptic impression. This impression is supposed to be so clear, so distinct, maybe so uniquely stamped by reality, that it just couldn't have come from anything other than the real object it represents interacting correctly with your mind. And because this special impression is already rational and propositionally structured for them, assenting to it guarantees you've grasped the truth. It's a high-status certified belief.
And the Epicureans, they don't really have an equivalent special term like catalepsis, do they? Their aim seems more general.
Right. Their goal is achieving true opinion. Doxa. Since they already believe all simple sense impressions are true by definition, because they're just physical events, they don't need a special name for the reliable input. For them, epistemic success isn't about finding a special impression. It's about the process that comes after. It's about making sure your interpretations, your opinions, or doxai are properly confirmed by, or at least don't clash with, those simple, true impressions you received earlier. Hashtag 2.2, the Epicurean argument for non-rationality, the error avoidance rationale.
Let's really dig into the Epicurean motivation here. Why this absolute insistence on non-rationality, even if it means the impression itself doesn't say much? It feels like a very deliberate, almost defensive philosophical move.
It absolutely is. It's driven by what you might call the error avoidance rationale. Their core premises: if you want genuine knowledge, you must start with a foundation that is necessarily error-free. Rock solid, no doubts possible. And as soon as you let interpretation, judgment, or reason get involved in that foundation, well, you've introduced the possibility of error right at the base.
And they were quite explicit that reason is the source of error.
Oh, completely. They looked around and saw quite reasonably that rational states, especially opinions, doxai, which involve putting concepts together, can be false. People get things wrong all the time when they interpret. For them, falsehood enters the picture precisely when reason does its thing. Synthesizing, predicating, adding or subtracting preconceptions, as they put it, to the raw sense data. Interpretation is fallible.
So if reason is the leaky pipe in your cognitive plumbing, then to make your ultimate criterion absolutely watertight, you have to completely isolate it from reason.
That's the logical bind they put themselves in. To function as a reliable, error-free criterion, the sense impression must be completely untainted by reason, even the automatic unconscious kind the Stoics talked about. Because if that Stoic subpersonal concept application was actually happening, the Epicureans would argue, then error could potentially infect the very first piece of data you get. Your basic stockpile could be corrupted from the start, and then how could you possibly use it to reliably test your later opinions?
It seems like they're sacrificing the immediate usefulness of the impression, its ability to tell you something specific, for the sake of absolute purity and infallibility.
That's the trade-off they make. The impression is guaranteed to be a true report of the existence of the sensory event itself, like a photograph accurately recording the light that hit the film. It's pure, uncorrupted by faulty human interpretation. It's a necessary starting point, even if it's a bit vague, because it avoids the risk of error right at the foundation. They chose certainty over specificity. Hashtag 2.3. The Stoic argument for rationality, the structure requirement rationale.
Okay, now let's clip back to the Stoic reasoning. Their calculation is the complete opposite. They prioritize the specificity, the propositional strength over that kind of absolute, untainted purity. Their rationale seems to be all about the structure requirement.
Exactly. They look at the Epicurean picture, these simple, non-rational impressions, and they basically say, well, how does that actually work for knowing things? If the goal of knowledge is to have true beliefs about the world, which means believing the right propositions, then your foundational evidence, your criterion, must be capable of representing those propositions clearly and specifically.
This gets us to their big criticism, the indeterminacy problem. How can raw, simple, non-rational sensation justify believing one specific claim over another?
It just can't, according to the Stoics. They argue that if sense impressions didn't have that built-in synthetic predicational structure, they'd be too basic, too ambiguous to support one specific proposition rather than its opposite, or even some other unrelated proposition. The raw data simply doesn't contain the logical grammar needed to make those fine distinctions.
Let's use that classic example they discussed, the knife and Caesar. How does that illustrate the problem?
Right, it's a really vivid illustration. So imagine you're an Epicurean, you get a sense impression. It's just a simple, non-rational visual imprint, a raw image. It shows a blade embedded in a person identified as Caesar. Now, that simple image is true. In the Epicurean sense, it accurately reflects the idola hitting your eye.
Yeah.
But what proposition does it actually justify believing?
Well, if it's just a static image, the mind looking at it later could form the opinion, Brutus stabbed Caesar.
Right, but here's the Stoic point. because the raw impression itself lacks the concepts of action, causation, directionality. It's just a snapshot. It could equally well support the completely incompatible proposition. Brutus is pulling a dagger out of Caesar. A simple picture of the end-state knife in body doesn't, by itself, tell you whether the knife was going in or coming out.
But hang on, couldn't the Epicurean just say, well, yeah, the impression is simple, but the mind interprets it later using context, memory, other information to figure out Brutus was stabbing him? Why does the ambiguity have to be resolved in the impression itself?
Because for the Stoics, it's all about justification. If the fundamental criterion, the impression itself, doesn't contain the structure that points specifically to stabbing rather than pulling out, then the observer has no criterial basis for choosing one interpretation over the other. The choice becomes arbitrary, based on factors outside the criterion itself. And if the criterion is indeterminate, it cannot ground catalepsis. It fails its job as the ultimate guarantor. The mind would just be guessing when forming the opinion.
I see. So the Stoics needed the concept stabbing versus pulling out to be applied automatically by the rational mind during the formation of the impression itself, making the impression inherently mean this is Brutus stabbing Caesar. That rational structure is what gives it the specificity to justify the belief.
Precisely. The things we know are propositions with structure. Therefore, the Stoics argued, the state that justifies those beliefs, the criterion, must also have that same kind of distinctive, rational, synthetic structure. It has to be rational. They're essentially willing to accept the risk that this automatic interpretation might occasionally go wrong in exchange for getting impressions that are specific enough to actually ground knowledge.
Wow. It really does feel like an impossible choice. Either your foundation is perfectly pure but too simple to tell you anything definite,
or it's definite and specific but potentially flawed because interpretation is baked right in from the start.
a genuine philosophical dilemma.
That's exactly what it is.
Now, we said the Epicureans pushed back the concept application, the synthesis to the stage of opinion, or doxa. This feels like a really important connection point, because when we look at what an Epicurean doxa actually is, structurally, it sounds identical to a Stoic rational sense impression.
It is. That's the fascinating, maybe slightly ironic, intersection between the two systems. Both schools actually agree on the structure that leads to potential error. And that structure is synthesis, putting concepts together with sensory input. So the Epicureans end up describing a mental state doxa, opinion which is formed when reason adds or subtracts preconceptions. Applying the concept human, or wealthy, or dangerous, to the raw data from the non-rational senses. And structurally, that looks exactly like the process the Stoics say happens within the sense impression itself.
And crucially, this is the point where the Epicureans explicitly admit that things can go wrong. This is where fallibility enters their system.
Absolutely. Epicurean opinions, because they involve this synthesis, this application of concepts, can be false. False opinions happen when we misapply a concept or predicate something wrongly based on the simple sense data.
Can you give an Epicurean example of how that works, how a false opinion forms?
Sure. A classic one is seeing someone far off. You get a simple, non-rational impression, a pattern of colors and shape delivered by the idola. That impression itself is true. It truly represents the atoms that hit your eye. But then your mind, in forming an opinion, might jump to apply the preconception, Plato. But you form the opinion, that is Plato walking over there. But maybe it's not Plato. Maybe it's someone who just looks like him from a distance. The error wasn't in the raw visual data, the sense impression. The error happened in the doxa, the interpretive act of applying the concept Plato incorrectly or prematurely.
Okay, so it really crystallizes the disagreement. It's not whether interpretation, synthesis happens or is risky. Both sides agree on that. It's purely about the timing.
Exactly. It boils down to, when does concept application occur? The Stoics say. It happens immediately, automatically, in the formation of a sense impression itself. That makes the impression rational, structured, and potentially criterial, if it's cataleptic. The Epicureans say, no, concept application happens later, after the simple, non-rational sense impression is already formed. It happens when we form an opinion, which is a separate, derived, and potentially fallible state.
They agree synthesis carries risk. They just fundamentally disagree on whether the ultimate foundation, the criterion, can afford to be synthetic.
Right. The Stoics are trusting that their special kind of impression, the cataleptic one, involves a flawless automatic synthesis. The Epicureans think any synthesis, automatic or not, is too risky for the foundation and must be kept separate. Hashtag 3.2. The ancient debate's logical structure and modern echoes.
This disagreement, the standoff, it feels incredibly neat, logically. It's like a perfect philosophical fork in the road.
It really is. You have two demands on your criterion of truth. It needs to be error-free, and it needs to be propositionally specific, and these two demands seem fundamentally incompatible, pushing you in opposite directions.
You mentioned earlier this has echoes in modern debates about foundationalism, maybe like Sosa's raft and the pyramid analogy. Can you expand on that connection?
Yeah, absolutely. Modern epistemology, especially foundationalism, wrestles with this exact same tension. The pyramid idea is that knowledge has to be built up layer by layer on a completely secure base. Both Stoics and Epicureans wanted that pyramid structure. The problem is, what are the foundational blocks made of? So Horn 1 of the dilemma, which mirrors the Epicurean critique of the Stoics, goes like this. If your supposed foundational state, like the Stoic impression, already includes rational interpretation, a propositional attitude, then it's not truly foundational. It's already an interpretation, not a direct, unmediated contact with reality. It might have errors built in.
So the Epicureans are basically saying to the Stoics, your foundation isn't raw bedrock. It's already concrete mixed with potentially faulty interpretations. Your pyramid might crumble.
Exactly. Now, Horn 2, the Stoic critique of the Epicureans. If your foundational state, the Epicurean impression, is purely non-rational, simple, lacking any propositional attitude, well, then it's too simple. It lacks the structure to specifically justify believing proposition P rather than not bet P. It can't actually support the complex structure of knowledge you want to build on top of it.
Right. The Stoics are saying, okay, your foundation blocks might be pure, unadulterated reality, but they're just disconnected points. They don't form a coherent surface. You can't build anything stable on them because they don't say anything specific.
That's the standoff. You either risk error in the foundation to get specificity, or you demand purity in the foundation and risk not being able to justify specific beliefs at all.
But let's push the Stoics a bit harder on their choice. This idea of an automatic, subpersonal, rational process that's always right when the impression is cataleptic. Doesn't that sound a bit, well, convenient, almost like magical thinking? The Epicurean challenge seems strong here.
It is a very strong challenge.
Yeah.
The Epicureans would absolutely say, hang on, you guys admit that when we consciously apply concepts, we often make mistakes. Why should we believe this unconscious automatic application is somehow magically infallible, even some of the time? The Stoics really had to bite the bullet on this one. Their answer relied heavily on the supposed phenomenal quality of the cataleptic impression itself. They argued it possesses this undeniable clarity, this distinctness, this feeling of having been stamped directly by reality that serves as an internal guarantee. It's as if the quality of the impression itself validates the automatic rational process that produced it. They're essentially saying, when the synthesis is done correctly by the automatic system, the resulting impression feels undeniably true and clear in a way no other impression does.
So they're relying on a feeling, a cognitive phenomenology, to underwrite the reliability of an otherwise risky interpretive step at the foundation.
Pretty much. Whereas the Stoic challenge, back to the Epicureans, never goes away.
Yeah.
Okay, your input is pure. Now what? How do you logically get from that pure, simple blob of sensation to a justified belief that this specific thing is true? That indeterminacy gap remains.
How can the criterion do its job of judging beliefs if it can't even represent the content of those beliefs?
Exactly. So this whole ancient debate really pushes us to reflect on our own experience. When we see something, are we just passively receiving raw data, like the Epicureans thought? Or is our rational mind instantly structuring and interpreting that data, as the Stoics believed, even before we're consciously aware of it?
The answer you lean towards really shapes your whole view of knowledge. #tag outro.
So this deep dive really shows, I think, that the famous Stoic Epicurean fight wasn't just about true versus false impressions in a simple sense. That was more like the outcome. The real battle was fought much deeper down, about the very structure of perception itself, about where our mind's interpretive work actually begins. Is it baked into the first contact, or does it come later?
Yeah, it lays bare this incredibly profound philosophical dilemma, and it's one we still grapple with, really. Do we prioritize making sure our foundational criteria are absolutely flawlessly untainted by any interpretation? That's the Epicurean path, demanding non-rational purity, even if it makes the foundation weak in terms of specifying content, leaving it vulnerable to indeterminacy. Or do we prioritize making sure our criteria are propositionally strong and specific enough to actually justify beliefs? That's the Stoic path, demanding rational structure right at the start, even if it means we have to trust in some kind of automatic, potentially fallible interpretive process being reliable, at least sometimes. The Stoics chose specificity, risking error. The Epicureans chose purity, risking paralysis. And both sides had compelling, logical reasons for their choice.
So maybe a thought to leave you with, especially today with, the fire hose of information we face. When you see a breaking news alert pop up or a graph shared online, think of that as your modern sense impression. What's your first impulse? Do you trust the raw data instantly? Prioritize its immediacy, its apparent lack of spin, that sort of Epicurean impulse for untainted input? Or do you immediately recognize that your own mind is already framing it, connecting it to things you already know, applying concepts and preconceptions? Do you feel that for it to be useful at all, the perception itself somehow needs to be structured and specific from the get-go, that Stoic necessity? Which approach feels like the safer bet for navigating the world today?
Something to definitely reflect on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the very architecture of how